Okay, welcome to Ricketts Lab and Cannery Row. Let me read the first sentence since we're standing here on Cannery Row. Cannery Row in Monterey in California is a poem, a stink, a grating noise, a quality of light, a tone, a habitat, a nostalgia, a dream. Yes, it still has noise. It's a bustling place normally. Of course, now during the pandemic, it's less bustling. But when Ricketts lived here, it was a very popular spot, and the street would have been full of people going to the canneries, working in the canneries. So it was a very industrial kind of, this is the heart of industrial Cannery Row. However, Steinbeck, when he wrote Cannery Row in 1945, doesn't really write about the business of Cannery Row, canning sardines. He writes about his friend, Ed Ricketts. The book is dedicated to Ed Ricketts, for Ed who knows why or should. And really, it's about Ed Ricketts and why he was such a remarkable man. The reason I like to start all my tours on the steps is I like to point out something that's very important in the book Cannery Row, because Steinbeck really asks us to see as Ricketts saw things. Ricketts enters this book looking into the intertidal with Hazel. They're talking about intertidal animals. And he exits the book reading poetry. And that's really what's extraordinary about this man. He was a scientist. He was a collector of marine invertebrates. His seminal work was a book called Between Pacific Tides, published in 1939. So he spent his life collecting marine invertebrates, which he called little beasties, because he loved his job. He loved what he did. It was really his vocation and his avocation as well. But he was also a man of ideas, and I think that's what drew people to him and drew people to this lab, which is really a kind of magnet for people who come to visit Monterey. Certainly people who have read Cannery Row, or know about Sea of Cortez, who have read the short story The Snake. All of those works, Ricketts is a central figure, either as co-author or as fictional character. So this is a kind of pilgrimage spot, this lab. Ricketts bought the lab in 1928 for $8,000. In the mid-90s, the city of Monterey bought the lab. They now own it. And they offer tours during non-pandemic times, so you can come to the lab. But today we're going to offer a virtual tour. The other reason I start the tour here is I want to point out that really Steinbeck starts out with that first sentence kind of mapping Cannery Row. Where are we? How do we describe Cannery Row? And he says in chapter 3, Lee Chong's is to the right of the vacant lot. Although why it's called vacant when it's piled high with old boilers, rusting pipes, gray square timbers, and stacks of 5-gallon cans, no one can say. Up and back of the vacant lot is the railroad track and the Palace Flophouse. Now that orientation where you're looking across the street at the vacant lot, up to the Palace Flophouse and Lee Chong's grocery, the Chinese grocery store to the right, is only accurate if you're standing right here or looking out the window. In chapter 5, he continues his mapping of Cannery Row, and he says Western Biological, the lab, was to the right across the street and facing the vacant lot. Lee Chong's grocery was on the catacorner right, and Dora's Bear Flag restaurant was on the catacorner left. And of course, that was the brothel really across the street from the lab. So from the very beginning of this book, Steinbeck asks you to see in the same way, with the same perspective that his friend Ed Ricketts had. So today I want to talk about that friendship, about Ed Ricketts as a man of science, as a man of ideas, and the importance of friendship to Steinbeck's fiction. Because if you think about it, most of Steinbeck's books are about friendships. That's the central relationship in his works of fiction. Think of George and Lenny and Of Mice and Men, Casey and Tom in The Grapes of Wrath, and Adam and Lee in East of Eden. So friendships are really key to understanding Steinbeck's fiction. I think he writes much more successfully about friendship than marriage. And partly it's because of the quality of his own friendship with Ricketts. Now, Steinbeck met Ed Ricketts in 1930 in probably in Carmel, at a party in Carmel. And they were close, really soulmates from 1930 to 1948. So now let's go into the lab, just as Steinbeck did on many, many days. People were drawn here to come talk to Ed, share in parties, bring the food for parties. They often had potlucks. And so this became a magnet and a place to gather. So we too will gather inside. Okay, this is the party room of the lab. And really it's party room. It's also Ricketts' bedroom. It was his workplace. He typed essays many nights. He had at one point a desk by the front door where Steinbeck's wife, Carol, worked and looked out the front door. He also had specimens in the next room. So really his workplace and his home were one and the same. Now, Ricketts didn't always live here. Prior to 1936, he also lived in various homes around the peninsula in Carmel and Pacific Grove with his wife, Anna, and their 3 children. It was a marriage that became contentious, partly because Ricketts was not the most faithful of husbands, and Anna finally left Ricketts in 1936. So his lab became his home. Also, in that year, the original lab burned. So it burned to the ground. Ricketts escaped with his typewriter and very little else. And it was a total loss. Mostly he mourned his library because he had a fine scientific library. And it was gone in this fire. And so he lost everything, all his papers, all his off-prints, all his scientific material. Friends gave him a book party for Christmas and tried to replace some of the books, but he couldn't replace the basically years of work on the study that he'd been doing. Now, if you think about Ricketts as both a man and a man of science, I just briefly want to kind of summarize his central ideas. And there are 5 words that I really want to stress when thinking about Ricketts. And the first is an ecologist. In an era when most scientists were still studying animals based on class and phyla, studying individuals, focusing on a certain individual, what Ricketts did, which was so extraordinary, is to look at animals in relation to one another, in relation to communities, in relation to where they lived. So the book that he wrote that advocates this whole vision is called Between Pacific Tides. And it's about looking at animal communities. So that first notion of being an ecologist and what that means is so important to understanding Ricketts. He was a pioneering ecologist that in the 1930s, people didn't use the word ecology, and they were just very frequently. And at Hopkins and Ricketts, they were starting to think about connections, about communities. The second, I think, really important term in understanding Ricketts is studying group behavior. Look at how animals in communities interact together. He was fascinated with group behavior. This is an idea that he and Steinbeck would have discussed because Steinbeck was also fascinated with group behavior. One only needs to think about the grapes of wrath and how the Joad family becomes a unit with the other migrants on the road, and what the power of the group is one of the things that Grapes of Wrath is about, from I to we. And that's an idea that he and Ricketts discussed in terms of animal communities and human communities. Another idea I think that was central to Ricketts is cooperation, a third idea. He talks about when he was going to do another intertidal handbook for high school students in the 1940s, he said we have to get over this idea of the central idea about animals living together is competition. He says cooperation is as important as competition. The fourth idea I really want to stress in understanding Ricketts is participation. That he really believed that you should participate fully in looking at life. So that so much of this is about seeing, how we see. And to participate fully is to really see, really understand. It's a word that Steinbeck also used when he wrote that he wanted his readers to participate fully in the text. And finally, non-teleological thinking, which is accepting life as it is, not always looking for solutions, not looking at the end of things, but being engaged in life as it is. Now, I mention those 5 ideas because they're all really embedded in Cannery Row. Cannery Row is about community. It's about groups, Mac and the boys in the inner title. It's about cooperation and what happens, how you give a party for Doc. It's about looking carefully. So Steinbeck weaves all of those important concepts that are so vital to their friendship, to Ricketts' work, to Steinbeck's work, into the little novel that we're celebrating here on its 75th anniversary. Now, all these ideas would have been discussed here in this room because when Steinbeck and Ricketts got together, they really talked about ideas. They love to talk about concepts like this. And one of the things that Ricketts says later about Sea of Cortez is, he says, it's so much a John Ed sit by the fire. Now, Sea of Cortez was the book that was published in 1941. Ricketts and Steinbeck worked on it together. But it has all the ideas that were discussed, sort of embedded in that text, nonfiction text, that were discussed in this room throughout the 1930s. It's really a compendium of ideas, or as Ed says, a John Ed sit by the fire. So other people would join them here in this room. Bruce Arras and his wife Jean. Richie Lovejoy was a reporter for the Monterey Herald. So Richie Lovejoy was a reporter for the Monterey Herald, and he and his wife Tal were excellent friends of Ricketts throughout his time here. There were people, the Lanistocks, who lived in Carmel. Francis Whitaker was a friend. Ricketts was really drew people to him. And in part, people would come here, as the director of Hopkins said, I came to the lab to help make myself feel better. Or other people said he would listen to whatever you said. So he would sit cross-legged on his cot, which was right under the windows here. And some people called him the Buddha. And he would simply listen to ideas and not criticize, but kind of talk to you and make your own ideas seem brilliant. So he made people feel better just by talking to them. There was a cot here under the window. Ricketts had a fine record player, which was right by the bed. He kind of insisted on changing the records because he didn't want people to scratch his record collection. He also had some speakers made. You can still see the speaker cabinets up here by a man named Paul Verbeck, who made a speaker system and a phonograph. Steinbeck liked it so much that he had one made for his own house in Los Gatos. There was a table that pulled down here, and some cups and shelves, and then, of course, books in the library. So the footprint is the same as it was. That's the kitchen. Typically, Ricketts loved to scramble up some eggs at 2 a.m. if he still had visitors. So it's a tiny little kitchen there. But one can only imagine the kind of conversation that went on in this room. Ricketts was, not only did he, those ideas that I was trying to focus on were so important to him, but he tried to capture those ideas in essays that he would write. So it seems sometimes like the man hardly slept, because he would type versions of essays. He wrote one on the spiritual morphology of poetry. He wrote one on friendship. He wrote an essay on wave shock, or the effects of waves hitting the coast in the inner harbor versus the outer coast. He was always writing scientific and philosophical essays. And those were also part of the conversation, of course, that went on here. When he was here, and this was before the fire, these walls were festooned with charts that he kept to record creativity throughout the ages. The man was just, sort of absolutely obsessed with charting and recording and organizing things. So he would have periods of history where they were great peaks of creativity. And he wanted to show that in different cultures, these peaks tended to be coordinated so that there would be periods like the Renaissance, where in art and music and culture, there would be this great surge of creativity. And those festooned his walls. So this is a model of the lab which shows what it looked like in Ricketts' time, and that's something that we want to take a closer look at just to see some of what I've been describing. Now what you see here now, though, is not the room, of course, decorated in the way that Ricketts would have decorated it. Because this building has two separate histories. It has the Ricketts period, when Ricketts was here from 1928 to 1948. But Ricketts was killed by a train up on Prescott in 1948. And the building was, of course, empty. A few months after Ricketts died, Steinbeck had most of his letters removed from the lab, the safe removed from the lab. And the building was rented by a man named Harlan Watkins, who was a high school teacher, and he lived here. And of course, being single and male, people came to parties, specifically on Wednesday nights here, but of course they used it as a party place, and so Harlan Watkins was popular for living in this kind of, what was then a kind of seedy area, but fun place to come. Now, Harlan Watkins got married a few years later, and his wife certainly said, "I'm not living on Cannery Row." So all the people who'd come to Harlan Watkins parties didn't want to lose their place of hilarity, so they bought this lab, okay, and that's called the men's group. And really, from the early 50s until a year ago, the men were part owners in this lab. Frank Wright was the last of the original group to die. But if you look behind you, I think you'll see the poster. Well, but I think you see three of the members here, Eldon Dedini, Gus Areola, and Hank Ketchum. All of them were created very, very significant comic strips. You're probably most familiar with Hank Ketchum and Dennis the Menace. There's Dennis the Menace Park in Monterey, but they were three quite famous members of the lab, and they are still stand by the door to greet you. This mural of pictures behind us was part of the decoration of the lab group. I was going to do an article once about the women who were involved in the lab, because it's always a men's group, and I said, well, what about the wives? Did they ever come here? And they did come here on weekends. It wasn't solely a men's gathering place. Wednesdays was apparently reserved for men. And the first woman who came to a Wednesday party was Renee Montaigne when she was doing a Ricketts special in 2003. So she was invited to come on Wednesday night, and she was the first female guest. But their wives did come on the weekends. And according to the woman I talked to, this mural was done by the women, not the men. So they created the mural of various figures from the 20th century. And the city has very carefully taken it down and restored it. So we have some Cannery labels. We have a couch that's been here, I'm sure, since the 1950s. And there's a couple of things I want to talk about here. This is a picture of Ed Ricketts by Jean Eris, who was actually Ricketts' lover for a while. Her brother took that picture of Ricketts looking down. You see a lot of pictures of Ricketts looking down because he had bad teeth. It was kind of a joke between Steinbeck and Ricketts. Ricketts had such bad teeth. And that's why when he wrote an essay about Ricketts called About Ed Ricketts, he said, "We met in a dentist office." But I think that's an inside joke about Ricketts and his bad teeth. A really interesting painting, or a print of a painting by a man named Elwood Graham. Now, Elwood Graham was an artist that both Ricketts and Steinbeck liked a lot, And Steinbeck tried to help support him by giving him some money, once to go to Mexico and once to paint his portrait. So Elwood Graham painted Steinbeck's portrait as he was writing Sea of Cortez in 1940. And at that time, Steinbeck was about to go through a divorce, and so it really shows him as a worried, perplexed, and very unhappy man, which he was. So it kind of captured how Steinbeck felt at that time. The family hated the painting, but Ricketts liked it. So Ricketts did hang it in the lab. So the original was at one point in the lab. Nobody quite knows where the original is now, although there were reports that John Huston ended up with it, and where it is now, no one knows. And then there's a little drawing by Bruce Arras, who was also a friend of Ricketts, even though his wife was having an affair with Ricketts. It seemed to be accepted pretty much by the group and well known. But Bruce taught Ricketts' son to box. He was a very kind of devoted father, and he and Jean had children together. And he was a great artist, and he also did a mural across the street. So he was a very well-known figure in Monterey. Whenever I think of Bruce and Jean Arras, and I did know them both, I think of them, their house burned down in the 90s. And the two of them, in their 70s, lived in a tiny tea house for I think about 2 years, while Bruce rebuilt his house. And it always represents the sort of spirit of the Depression and just making do. And if you don't have money, you simply adapt. And I think that Bruce and Jean really represented that. The sequel to Cannery Row, which is called Sweet Thursday, Ricketts is doing an experiment with octopi and the excitability of octopi. I've worn my octopus necklace today in honor of Ricketts and his research for that paper in Sweet Thursday. So as Steinbeck called him Doc in Cannery Row and Sweet Thursday, Ricketts was called by people here Ed and Ricketts, but he was also called Doc on occasion. Burgess Meredith called him Doc, so it was a name that was occasionally given to Ricketts. So the man in fiction is fairly close to the man in fact, but as Steinbeck said when he wrote his essay about Ricketts, this is my Ed Ricketts. This is who he was to me. So when he said his mind had no horizons, he was paying tribute to the remarkable qualities of his friend, Ed Ricketts.
When he bought the building, one of the reasons that he was intrigued about moving in here was that the previous owners, which were the La Esperanza Fish Packing Company, had built these tanks to salt fish. So they would bring in mackerel or sardines, put them in the tanks, have them swim around in the brine for a while, and then they would press all of the liquid out of them and make kind of a fish jerky. But Ricketts had different ideas. What he wanted to do was to store marine animals in each of these tanks so that when he got an order that he needed to fill for his biological supply company, he could go in the backyard, find what he needed, and then fill that order. So one of these tanks might have been filled with sea urchins and another with anemones. He was able to collect all of those organisms in the rocky intertidal right here on the shores of Monterey Bay. Ricketts is most famous for his work, which is called Between Pacific Tides. It was first published in 1939 by Stanford University Press, and the book is still in print today, which is remarkable when you consider that it has been edited since Ricketts' time by a number of other different people who have made their own contributions to it. It was actually quite difficult for Ricketts to get this book published because it took a look at the littoral zone, or the rocky intertidal, and the organisms that lived there in a far different way than people had ever approached it before. He took an ecological approach. When Ricketts was an undergraduate at the University of Chicago, he became influenced by a professor named W.C. Ali. And Dr. Ali was an early proponent of ecology, or looking at the big picture, a holistic view of the world. But nobody had really used that technique to describe the rocky intertidal. Let's talk about Monterey Bay. In a 6-hour period on Monterey Bay, the tide can fluctuate to almost 8 feet. I'm 6 foot 3 inches tall, and if I reach up, that's about 8 feet. That means that a high tide would be where my hand is, and a low tide would be where my feet are right now. And that is a tremendous shift in the amount of seawater along the coast. The animals that live in that very rigorous environment, which are sometimes inundated by seawater and sometimes exposed to the air, have to be able to adapt to a very constantly changing environment. And that's what fascinated Ricketts. So his book is designed in such a way to talk about different sections of the coastline of Monterey Bay. Some of the chapters are on the rocky intertidal, some are on the sandy beach, some are on the slough. All of those different organisms that live in that intertidal zone are examined, not individually. You'll never find a chapter in this book about starfish or another chapter about sea anemones. Instead, you'll find a chapter about the habitat in which they live. But not only that, you'll find in between Pacific tides that there is an examination of the relationships that exist between the different types of organisms. He was more interested in looking at an animal in the context of the environment in which he lived, which is the whole idea of ecology. So how did Ed Ricketts really make a living? He didn't make very much money at all by being a writer. He made money by having a biological supply company called Pacific Biological Laboratories. So although most of the organisms that he sold were marine organisms, he also was able to sell, his number one biggest seller was the frog. The frog is a classic dissection that you find in high school biology classes, and consequently, a lot of collecting was done up in Carmel Valley in order to supply the frogs necessary for him to run his business. He also raised other terrestrial organisms. For instance, he would sell preserved cats for study in zoology classes. His clients were either high school or college science courses that would use his organisms or his specimens for dissection and study purpose. What we're going to do now is actually go into the downstairs area at Pacific Biological and take a look at his work area, which is right inside the door in the back of the building. Okay, so now we're downstairs in Pacific Biological Laboratories. This is the actual room where Ed Ricketts would prepare specimens for biological study. Behind me are two historical photographs which were taken by Ed Ricketts Jr. of his father, Ed Ricketts, working at the station that I'm standing in front of right here. Most of the containers that you see at this station right now are actually not left over from Ed Ricketts. They're actually left over from Ed Ricketts Jr., who was an amateur photographer. So most of these are spent photographic chemicals, which are actually probably toxic time bombs that need to be gotten rid of. But if you take a close look at this photograph on the wall, what you can see are the types of organisms that Ed Ricketts dealt in. So most of these are marine organisms as he's doing his preparation work. But the second photograph is even more fascinating than the front. Not merely because Ed Ricketts is showing a Gila monster to a young girl, but the story of that young girl. Ed Ricketts actually had a common law wife who lived in Pacific Biological Laboratories with him, who was named Toni Jackson. And Toni had a daughter named Kay. Kay actually died of a brain tumor when she was 12 years old, which was the stress that brought an end to the relationship between Ed Ricketts and Toni Jackson. But he used to share his knowledge of marine organisms and other natural wonders with the children of Cannery Row. And that's one of the reasons why they referred to him as Doc. It was a sign of respect that they gave him the nickname Doc. It's important to realize that Ed Ricketts not only was not a PhD, he never earned a college degree in anything. In fact, that was one of the things that he had in common with John Steinbeck. John Steinbeck dropped out of Stanford University without ever earning a degree. Yes, he did go on later to win both the Pulitzer Prize and the Nobel Prize for his writing. And Ed Ricketts never took a degree, even though he went to the University of Chicago. Both of them became very famous for what they accomplished in life, not for what they accomplished in the classroom. So the other thing that really distinguishes Ed Ricketts and makes him still valuable today, besides his work with Between Pacific Tides, is what he did with the index card. In front of you here, there are some 3x5 and 5x7 cards which are color-coded to tell from which region a certain organism was collected. All of these cards now are over at Stanford University's library at Hopkins Marine Station, so that a marine ecologist today can examine these cards, which were filled out by Ed Ricketts in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, in which he was describing the relative abundance and diversity of the marine organisms that were found on the west coast of North America. But a zoologist today, in 2020, can compare what those organisms' abundance is today to what they were 50, 60, 70 years ago and get an idea of trends. Is that organism doing better? Is it doing worse? Is it flatline? It's a treasure of information that Ed Ricketts left behind him. All of those cards were stored in these metal filing cabinets, which is a good thing because on Thanksgiving Day in 1936, this original building burned down. And one of the few things that actually survived that fire on Thanksgiving Day were his index cards because they were in metal filing cabinets. Some of them have singed edges, but they're all still legible. In fact, if you want to read those cards, you can simply go to the Hopkins Marine Station Library website, and they have a very precise PDF made of each one of the cards, both sides, so that you can read the information, and it's right there at your fingertips. Or better still, if you were to write to the assistant librarian, Don Coors, who administers that website, he would probably show you the original cards if you had a reason to take a look at them. So in this area, Ed Ricketts did his work. Like I said earlier, most of these bottles had nothing to do with his work in Pacific Biological Laboratories. There are a few artifacts that do say University Apparatus Company and Pacific Biological that are still here, but not very many. Most of the other bottles are simply empty bottles. So earlier I mentioned that Ed Ricketts was exploring the littoral zone or the intertidal zone along the coast of North America. Between Pacific Tides covers that area along the coast of California, Oregon, and Washington. But in 1940, Ricketts and Steinbeck decided that they wanted to expand their investigation into the intertidal zone that went much further south than that. In 1936, they actually drove to Baja, which is a very difficult thing to do because Baja roads are notoriously bad. They were even worse in 1936. So after they made that trial run of an investigation of the Sea of Cortez or the Gulf of California in an automobile, they decided to do it better in 1940. In 1939, Ricketts had just finished publishing Between Pacific Tides, and in 1939, John Steinbeck had just finished publishing The Grapes of Wrath, which was his masterpiece. Both of them wanted to get out of town and do something new and different. So what they proposed to do was to charter a boat called the Western Flyer and take it down for a 6-week investigation of the littoral zone in the Sea of Cortez. This is one of the things that actually went on that expedition. This desk, this fold-down desk, was actually designed by Ed Ricketts and John Steinbeck. You can see this is their original hand-drawn blueprint of what they wanted in a desk that would be on a ship that would be a convenient way for them to do their office work at the end of a day of collecting. And this artifact is now here at Pacific Biological Laboratories for all to enjoy. One of the things I want to read to you is an example of how John Steinbeck used to make fun of himself. Because if you've ever read The Sea of Cortez, you know that it's a humorous way that he takes a look at the day-to-day life aboard the Western Flyer. So this is a passage from Sea of Cortez. In a small boat, the library should be compact and available. We had constructed a strong steel-reinforced wooden case, the front of which hinged down to form a desk. This case holds about 20 large volumes and has 2 filing cases, one for separates or scientific reprints, and one for letters. A small metal box holds pens, pencils, erasers, clips, steel tape, scissors, labels, pins, rubber bands, and so forth. Another compartment contains a 3x5 card file. There are cubby holes for envelopes, large separates, typewriter paper, carbon, a box for India ink and glue. The construction of the front makes room for a portable typewriter, drawing board, and T-square. There is a long, narrow space for rolled charts and maps. Closed, this compact and complete box is 44 inches long by 18 by 18. Loaded, it weighs between 300 and 400 pounds. It was designed to rest on a low table or in an unused bunk. We took it aboard the Western Flyer. If there had been a low table or large bunk, it would have been perfect. So what he was saying is that the thing was so big that it ended up being lashed to the deck of the Western Flyer with the tarp on top of it, and they never used it. So it was an indication that John Steinbeck wasn't too stuffy to make fun of himself. In fact, he made fun of everything during the Sea of Cortez expedition. One of the things that he made fun of more than anything else was an outboard motor that was used to pilot a skiff between the Western Flyer and their collecting spots in the Rocky Intertidal. It's a Johnson Seahorse outboard motor. However, they gave it the derogatory name, the Hansen Sea Cow, whereas the sea cow was a slow, unreliable marine animal. And it turns out that the Johnson Seahorse would only operate when it wanted to. And consequently, the crew of the Western Flyer used to have to row the skiff between the Western Flyer and their collecting stations each day because the motor would never cooperate with them. People often ask, is Cannery Row, the novel written by John Steinbeck, a true story or is it fiction? And the answer is yes, it's both. You can get a really good idea of the life and times of Ed Ricketts by reading the book. In fact, the dedication of the book is for Ed Ricketts who knows why or should. And Ricketts actually had the opportunity to suggest any type of edits before it went to press, and he decided to let it go as it was because he said it was written with kindness and it really did give an idea of what it was like on Cannery Row. There are some things that are described in this book that are absolutely the truth, like the floor plan of Pacific Biological Laboratories. There are other things that never happened. For instance, there was never a party upstairs in which a big crate of frogs escaped and then went down the front steps and escaped to Cannery Row. So as you read it, you can get an idea of what life was like on Cannery Row. The book is constructed in a number of different ways. When John Steinbeck was asked why there were so many interstitial chapters in this book that seemed like they had nothing to do with the narrative itself or the gist of the story, he said, well, they're tide pools, of course. If I look in a certain tide pool, I'm going to find a different assemblage of life than if I look in a different tide pool over here. And that's what Steinbeck was trying to do. There are a bunch of chapters here that seem like they have nothing to do with the story of life on Cannery Row, but at the same time they have everything to do with life on Cannery Row. I'm standing in front of the skiff, or actually a reproduction of the skiff, that was taken on the Western Flyer. It's called the Baby Flyer. The Western Flyer is a story in its own right. The Western Flyer was the purse seiner or sardine boat that Ed Ricketts and John Steinbeck hired for a 6-week expedition into the Sea of Cortez in the spring of 1940. That boat is actually being restored in Port Townsend, Washington right now. And the hero that actually saved that boat is a man named John Gregg, who was a petroleum engineer who decided that it was important enough to convert the boat into a floating classroom for school children to benefit from. When the boat is finally completed, it's going to be home ported here in Monterey, California, and school children will be able to go out on Monterey Bay and learn about the marine environment. It'll be a very high-tech edition of the Western Flyer. The Western Flyer was first built in the 1930s, and it had a very hard life. It was a sardine boat in Monterey Bay. It fished for rock cod up along the Oregon and Washington coasts. Then it was brought up to Alaska, where it fished for salmon and for king crab. It sunk 3 times, and even though it was on the bottom of the ocean, it sold for $1 million, and it was brought back to Port Townsend, Washington, and it's being completely refurbished. A lot of that boat is going to survive. It'll probably have about 20% of its original DNA once it's completely restored, but it's going to have a lot of features that it didn't have originally. For instance, it's going to have an ROV, or remotely operated vehicle, that school children can operate in order to go below the waves on Monterey Bay and take a look at the marine life that exists in this area. So once Ricketts and Steinbeck came back from the Sea of Cortez, they sat down to write a book about their adventure. There's actually 2 books in one here. The first part of this book is written like a diary. Rather than being chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, it'll say things like March the 12th, March the 13th, March the 14th, and each of those chapters describe on a daily basis where they were collecting, what their adventures were, how much beer they drank. It was a very entertaining narrative written by John Steinbeck, with the exception of one chapter. There's one chapter in this book which is called the Easter Sunday chapter. And what John Steinbeck did in order to help his friend Ed Ricketts have one of his essays published, Steinbeck actually inserted an essay that Ed had written on what is called non-teleological thought, or is thinking, in which Ricketts argued that the most important thing that we consider in our lives is what is happening in the here and now, that the past is dead and we can't do a thing about it, that the future is too unpredictable. But if we look at things non-teleologically, or if we employ is thinking, then we really can get the best measure as to what is going on in our lives. So that essay is inserted here. The other half of the book, the second half of the book, is actually the biological investigation of all of the marine organisms that were encountered on the Sea of Cortez expedition. So it's incredible when you think that 2 college dropouts, Steinbeck and Ricketts, went to the Sea of Cortez on their own. It wasn't a funded scientific expedition. It was them doing this for interest, and they were actually able to identify 34 species of marine organisms that were never described by science, and that is a pretty remarkable thing. The specimens that they collected in Mexico on the Sea of Cortez expedition are now up at the Cal Academy of Science in San Francisco. I'm standing in front of the safe that Ed Ricketts used to own at Pacific Biological Laboratories. This safe actually has a very interesting history. It was on the 2nd floor on Thanksgiving Day 1936 when a fire broke out, and Ricketts was lucky to escape with his life. The fire actually started next door at a cannery, and it was an electrical fire that soon spread to Pacific Biological Laboratories. Ricketts woke up at 5 in the morning. He smelled smoke. He felt the wall, which was red hot. He had just enough time to grab his typewriter, put on a pair of pants, run downstairs, and back his car out of the driveway, and the entire building was consumed in fire. and was completely destroyed, except for this safe. The safe crashed through the burning floor and landed on the cement on the first floor, but it was in perfect condition once it was removed from the rubble. So the safe actually was brought back into the reconstructed building. This Pacific Biological Laboratories that you're seeing right now was the rebuilt version of the building that was built in 1937. And the safe was on the second floor. Recently, the safe has been brought back here. It was in the possession of John Steinbeck originally after Ricketts died. And later, it was purchased and then donated to the city of Monterey to be stored here at Pacific Biological Laboratories. Okay, now we're in the party room, which is the back room on the second story of Pacific Biological Laboratories. Originally, until 1948, when Ed Ricketts was living here, this was 2 rooms. If you're in the building, you can actually see a very faint scar along the ceiling, which is left over from the partition that separated a very small room over here where Ed Ricketts Jr. had a cot to sleep on, from a slightly larger room where Ed Ricketts Sr. and Toni Jackson lived with her daughter Kay. This room eventually became a party room, and you can see that it's changed a lot since then. For instance, there are a bunch of alcohol bottles on this back wall behind the bar. There were 21 members in the lab group, and if you count them, there are 21 cubby holes, with the idea being that each of the members of the lab group would have their own supply of alcohol, and neither of the two would mix. The person that I'm going to highlight today is a man named Frank Wright. His cubby hole is right here. Frank Wright was the last surviving member of the Pacific Biological Laboratories men's group, and after he died, I actually found his high school diploma from Lowell High School in San Francisco, and I put it in his cubbyhole as a little reminder of who used to have his booze there. And he graduated from high school in 1937, a long time ago. He lived to be 97 years old, and until the day he died, he thoroughly enjoyed coming to Pacific Biological Laboratories and sharing it with other people. So how did Frank Wright, along with 20 other guys, end up being the Pacific Biological Laboratories men's group? There are only 2 members of the men's group who actually knew Ed Ricketts. One was Frank Wright. The other was Bruce Arras. Bruce Arras actually dated way before Frank Wright. Bruce Arras was a writer and an artist during the Great Depression that spent a lot of time here in Pacific Biological Laboratories philosophizing with Ricketts and Steinbeck. In fact, Bruce Arras and his wife Jean, along with Ricketts and Steinbeck, drove a car to the Sea of Cortez in 1936 in order to investigate marine life down there. And that was kind of a precursor to the Sea of Cortez expedition. The way that the men's group actually formed is that Harlan Watkins used to actually live here. After Ricketts died, he moved in here, and it was his bachelor pad. Harlan Watkins was an English teacher at Monterey High School, and he wanted to engage his literature students by having them come down here to Pacific Biological and read passages from Cannery Row in the place where it was actually written. It was a very compelling way for him to involve his students in a little bit of local history. However, when Harlan Watkins met the woman of his dreams and decided to get married, his wife refused to live here on Cannery Row, which was at that time more of a post-industrial wasteland because the sardine canneries had all closed and it was a very seedy part of town. So Harlan wanted to still have access to this building, and he was trying to figure out a way in order to do that. Along came Frank Wright. One day, Frank Wright went to a hamburger joint on Webster Street in Monterey, and the place was really crowded. So he sat down at a table, and he started eating his lunch, and another man walked up who turned out to be Harlan Watkins and said, "Hey, the place is crowded. Do you mind if I share your table with you?" and the two men started having lunch together. In the course of their conversation, Harlan said, oh, you know what, I live in the old Pacific Biological Laboratories on Cannery Row, the place where Ed Ricketts used to live. And Frank Wright said, well, that's a huge coincidence because I was in the Army with Ed Ricketts and I knew him quite well during that time that we were in the Army together. And the two men started talking about how they could preserve Pacific Biological Laboratories. What they ended up doing was recruiting 19 of their friends. They bought this building, and every Wednesday they would have a dinner party. And then once a month, rather than just having a dinner party for the lab members, they would also invite their wives and girlfriends, and it would be a little bit bigger dinner party. There's one more major claim to fame of the Pacific Biological Laboratories men's group, and that is the Monterey Jazz Festival. One of the common interests that the men in the Pacific Biological Laboratories men's group shared was an interest in jazz music. In fact, one of them was a personal friend of Jimmy Lyons, who was a DJ up in San Francisco, who was well connected in the jazz community. And they all decided that wouldn't it be a cool thing to have a jazz festival right here in Monterey, California. In 1958, the original Monterey Jazz Festival had its debut on September 17th, 18th, and 19th of 1958, and the people who played are noteworthy, even if you're not a jazz fan. I'm just going to read you a few of these names. Louis Armstrong, Miles Davis, Rex Stewart, Dizzy Gillespie, Duke Ellington, Clark Terry, Charlie Mingus, Henry Red Allen, Harry James, Mary Lou Williams, Earl Father Hines. So those are all the luminaries of the jazz community that were first recruited to the Monterey Jazz Festival. Although she's not on the original poster, Billie Holiday also made an appearance at that inaugural jazz festival. The people in the men's group all had their own special talents. One of the contingents of that men's group were 3 artists who are all world famous. This poster was actually drawn by Eldon Dedini, one of 3 cartoonists who were in the men's group, the Pacific Biological Laboratories men's group. This is also an Eldon Dedini picture. This celebrated the New Year's Eve party that the men's group had here on New Year's Eve in 1958 that was turning into 1959. You might notice that Eldon Dedini's work is very recognizable. Eldon Dedini was actually Hugh Hefner's favorite cartoonist for Playboy magazine. And although this woman isn't wearing very much, what she is wearing says Pacific Biological Laboratories on it. So in addition to Eldon Dedini, who is one of the 3 famous cartoonists in the Pacific Biological Laboratories men's group, there was also Gus Arriola, who was the cartoonist who did Gordo, which was my personal favorite cartoon when I was growing up, and Hank Ketchum. Hank Ketchum was the artist who did Dennis the Menace, which is still in syndication today. All 3 of these guys have passed away years ago, but all of their work lives on. Gus Arriola had a very respectful insight into Hispanic culture, and Gordo, his cartoon strip, was not only humorous, it was also able to teach you a little bit. For instance, every time he used a Spanish word, there'd be an asterisk, and he would tell you what that Spanish word meant. So as a young child growing up, I was entertained by the cartoon, but I was also learning a lot in the process.